I'm going to be talking about how I've used concepts and approaches in mindfulness in my current practice in addiction management. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I also use psychopharmacology to treat things such as depression, anxiety, psychosis, bipolar disorder. And one of the most common questions that happens in my practice is, do I have an anxiety disorder? Do I have a depression disorder? How much depression is too much depression? When do we call it a problem? How much anxiety is too much of a problem? In the addiction field, how much wine is too much wine? When is it addiction? How much cocaine is too much, right? That question of when does it cross that boundary is something that is very tricky. And one of the more easy ways that we can see it, though, is when there's incongruence, right? When the anxiety is occurring in a setting where anxiety might not be logical, or when the depression or the sadness is incongruent with the environment, or when a person is drunk in the middle of an audience and no one else is drinking, right? When there's incongruence, we start to get a better understanding of how the behavior or the emotions are not matching with things. And what I want to talk about today is this concept of how sometimes there can be incongruence just generated by the body alone. Right, we've seen the Snickers commercial, right? This idea of you are not you when you're hungry. And it definitely begs the question when I watch these commercials, is why can't a person just simply say, I'm hungry? Why does it manifest sometimes with this raging emotion when the internal experience can be something that we already have a label for? And sometimes it'll work in the reverse. Sometimes a person can have a situation where a raging anger might be appropriate, but instead they get hungry, and then they go eat donuts or a tub of ice cream. How is it that these emotions get cross-wired so that one behavior or so one type of emotion might manifest as another, or an appropriate emotion might turn into something inappropriate? This, of course, is very important in the addiction world, and those of you that might be familiar with 12-step work might have heard the acronym HALT, which is if you're feeling craving or if you're feeling aggravated, are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired? So to that general wisdom that the internal experience will affect both your emotions and your behavior is something that goes even before 12-step work. So I want to talk a little bit about how this looks inside the brain. And one of the core concepts here is that the internal experience, your internal organs, are telling your brain information just as much as the outer world. So your CNS, your brain, is mapping and looking around for input about how the environment is going and how things are going on in the internal environment. The first part where we use our senses, our ear gate, as we heard about earlier, our nose, our eyes. This is called exteroception. This is how we take in the outer world. And then interoception is how we take in the inner world. These are the bodily sensations. Often when we talk in psychiatry about therapy, there's a lot of discussion about cues, external environment, but one thing that's often very overlooked is the importance of the internal environment. And that's something that we want to talk about today. And one of the basic concepts here is that both the drives that are generated, as well as the emotions, the information is processed in your brain in a way that it needs to maintain homeostasis. And by that, we mean the internal experience tells your brain what's going on, and your brain will react in a way to help you obtain body homeostasis. And these are usually referred to as drives. Now, the important component here is that your drives are the things that create what we call a very conscious awareness of emotion. So the drives would be things like hunger, thirst, libido. We heard the mouse experiment or rat experiment earlier about attachment. These primary drive emotions will generate an internal experience that is uniquely uncomfortable. Very, very uncomfortable, and that's what we saw in that rat experiment. In contrast, emotions that are generated by exteroception, this could be fear, anger, sadness, these actually do not have a valence. By themselves, in and of themselves, the behavioral program that is generated by fear or anger or sadness does not necessarily have a physical discomfort by itself. What happens is that as these processes go through the brain, they are attached a discomfort by interoception. So you can do an experiment where a person could be exposed to a fearful stimulus, and if they're, or say a neutral stimulus, and if they're hungry, they will see that neutral stimulus as something anxiety-provoking. Or you might do the reverse. You could give a person a fearful stimulus, and if they're not hungry and they're in homeostasis, they might not interpret that stimulus in the same way. So the valence, or the good and bad nature of our external experience, is very much colored by our internal experience. The region of the brain where this is all happening is called the insula. Now, we'll probably come back to some of this later. When we think about mindfulness and awareness and that idea of bare attention, the concept that I use most in my practice is that when we start using bare attention to experience our internal sensations, that gives us a better chance of separating the signal from the intera from our emotional response. And the information is processed in what's called the insula right here. Let me see if this little pointer will give me something. Nope. So the insula there is circled. If we take a closer look at what the insula looks like, it's almond-shaped, or kind of pear-shaped, I suppose. And the important component here is that on the left-hand side, it says dynamic updates. And in the right-hand corner, this is somatosensory cortex. This is exteroception. It's feeding into the insula, into that posterior region, which is also taking in information from your body states. So in general, as information is coming in from the outside world, it is getting integrated with your internal state in a moment-by-moment basis. The concept that came up a lot in Epstein's talk is that a lot of the learning and memory that happens throughout life locks things in. So regions that fire together, wire together. You've probably heard that concept, right? Which is the idea that when things integrate, your brain locks that information in because it wants to prepare you. So that if this happens again, it can quickly pull up, oh, we don't like that person. Or, oh, this made us sad. It wants to integrate this so it can establish homeostasis a lot faster. So each time we lock something in, our brain records it, and then it starts to create the narrative that we spoke about that might have come up a lot, which is, this is how we feel in this context. Information in the other part of the cortex helps to give us a substrate for experiential perception. So this information from the insula then importantly sends over information to the amygdala, and we've all heard of the amygdala as our fear center. The amygdala is actually there for valence, which can be both fear, but it can also be happiness. It's basically attaching the color to all of our emotional experiences. Why does all this matter? Well, in psychiatric disease, and we won't go through the entire list here, there's often an imbalance in the way that a patient or a person is able to interpret their internal experience. And that imbalance could be something, if you look over at depression, I can't see it from here myself, but with depression, a person will lose their appetite. They might no longer sense that there is a hunger. And that's often because the ability to read the body or to understand what's happening in the enteric system isn't there as much, so they'll behave accordingly. So the ability to develop homeostasis gets thrown off in many different psychiatric disorders. One of the big finds over the past 20 years is, with mindfulness, a lot of research is going into which components of mindfulness tend to be helpful for which people. And that's what I want to lead to, which is this idea that with mindfulness, there are concentration components, as we learned about earlier, and then there's a mindfulness direction, right? So when you have meditation, it can be focusing on one thing, and then mindfulness awareness. And what's been shown in a lot of research is that if you take two different groups of people, and one group is doing a body-focused type of mindfulness, and the other is doing more of a thought and emotion-focused version, the groups that are developing body awareness tend to do better as far as managing anxiety. Now, that could be that without doing body focus, you can't do thought and logic focus, right? So in classic Buddhism, you do attention, body, and then thoughts and feelings first. But in general, it's been found that in managing anxiety, body awareness is one of the critical components towards restructuring some of the brain's interpretations of these body sensations. And this study here was looking at the insula, the right insula, and what they found was that before and after body awareness mindfulness, there was a change in the insula's connectiveness to different regions of the brain. Now, that's a big deal in the sense that, well, of all the regions in the brain, the one region that we know to be directly connected to enteric or interoception was the region that adjusted the most. Seeing that there's enhanced connection just tells us that something's happening. So let me back away from it a little bit. It just says that that region is changing. We don't know if those new connections are inhibitory or activation, but it does point to this idea that by having bare attention, no interpretations, nothing dramatic, bare attention to one's enteric sensations starts to develop and change the structure of this insular region. And sorry to rush through. Hopefully there'll be questions later. Thank you.